Russia has just made a worrying advance towards Finland's borders, making clear preparations for a confrontation with NATO. This comes as satellite imagery confirms significant Russian military construction near Finland's recently fortified border.
With signs Russia is beefing up its military presence along its western border, specifically along its 830-mile frontier with Finland, a country which since April 2023 has been a member of NATO, along with its neighbour Sweden.
Putin is already looking for his next target. And lucky for him, he's got a big list of countries to choose from. Russia shares its borders with 14 countries, plus maritime borders with Japan and the US. That's a lot of neighbors. And over the years, Russia has clashed with most of them. Some of these disputes are recent, but many go way back, long before the Soviet Union even collapsed. In fact, Putin's never quite gotten over that collapse. He openly said it was a tragedy, and it seems like he still dreams of bringing back the USSR in some way. First, he took Crimea in 2014. Then he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin might not say it out loud, but his actions are pretty obvious. He's trying to claw back lost power and territory. Right now, the countries along Russia's borders, especially the ones that backed Ukraine, are getting nervous, wondering if they're next in line. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he thought it would be a show of force, a reminder that Russia was still a superpower, and that defying Moscow came with consequences. But instead of sending a message of dominance, the war exposed its weaknesses. For the first time in decades, the Russian military looked vulnerable, struggling against a tiny nation. What was supposed to be a quick, clean operation turned into a drag-out, brutal mess that left Russia exposed and bleeding. And the world noticed. Countries that had once stayed neutral or silent out of fear began to act. Finland and Sweden, once neutral for decades, joined NATO out of sheer fear. Even Japan, which had been quiet about its disputes with Russia, began openly challenging Moscow's claims over the Kuril Islands. And now, with the war in Ukraine nearing its end, Putin is looking for payback. But here's the thing. A weakened Russia doesn't mean it's harmless. Even with its flaws, it's still armed, still aggressive, and still unpredictable. And that's why the countries on its borders are bracing for whatever happens next. If things keep escalating, this could easily spiral into something much bigger, maybe even the next world war. The thing is, Russia's border problems didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's a century-old obsession. And to understand why Putin and Russia as a whole thinks the way it does today, we need to go back, not just to the fall of the Soviet Union, but to how it all began. And if you're still watching, you already know that stories like this don't really get pushed by the algorithm. Putin doesn't want this seen, and frankly, neither does YouTube. So if you want to spread this truth, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps fight the silence and keeps this kind of content alive. The Soviet Union came into existence in 1922, rising from the ruins of the Russian Empire after years of revolution and civil war. Under Lenin, and then eventually Stalin, the USSR quickly expanded, swallowing up vast territories across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Siberia. On paper, it was a union of equal republics, but in reality, everything was tightly controlled from Moscow. Military force, political repression, and a relentless push for ideological dominance kept it all together. But the Soviets didn't stop at their own borders. They built a ring of satellite states, seized new lands in World War II, and turned half of Europe into a buffer zone against the West. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union was a global superpower, but its rapid territorial expansion planted the seeds for many of today's conflicts. But then World War II changed everything. Stalin, ever the opportunist, used the chaos to push the USSR's borders outward. First, in 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the brutal Winter War, claiming it was to protect Leningrad. The Finns fought like hell, but in the end, they lost 11% of their territory, including Karelia. They kept their independence, but at a steep cost, living in the Soviet shadow for the next 5 decades. Stalin wasn't done. In 1940, the USSR annexed the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, along with parts of Romania. And in the final days of World War II, Soviet troops stormed the Kuril Islands, expelling Japanese residents and solidifying control. When the war ended, Moscow controlled not just its 15 republics, but a whole network of communist puppet states, like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and more. The Kremlin had built a massive empire, and it had no intention of letting it slip away. Moscow ruled with an iron grip. Stalin loved to play with borders, redrawing them at will, shifting populations, and setting up future conflicts in the process. In the Caucasus, for example, he deliberately placed Nagorno-Karabakh, a historically Armenian region, under Soviet Azerbaijan, ensuring that one day it would explode into war. In Georgia, he granted Abkhazia and South Ossetia a level of autonomy that later fueled separatist movements. And in Central Asia, Soviet officials drew borders that cut across ethnic lines, mixing communities together in ways that only worked under the dictatorship of the Communist Party. While the USSR was intact, these divisions were manageable and held together by sheer force. But once Soviet control slipped, all these unresolved territorial tensions came roaring back. And whenever those tensions did surface, Moscow responded with brute force. When Hungary tried to break free in 1956, Soviet tanks crushed the uprising. When Czechoslovakia attempted to reform in 1968, the Kremlin sent in the army. These actions were warnings to every republic and satellite state that if you step out of line, you'll be dealt with. This imperial mindset extended beyond Europe too. Even with China, once a communist ally, relations soured fast. The Sino-Soviet split in the 1950s turned into an outright border war by 1969, with the two countries clashing along the Ussuri River and Xinjiang. The fighting nearly escalated into a full-scale war, and China never forgot how Russia had carved away parts of its territory back in the 19th century. That historical distrust still lingers today. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union looked powerful from the outside, but cracks were forming beneath the surface. The economy was stagnating, nationalist movements were gaining momentum, and Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe was starting to slip. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, and suddenly, people felt free to demand change. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and one by one, Soviet-backed communist regimes collapsed across Europe. Even inside the USSR, the cracks became too big to ignore. The Baltic republics wanted out, Ukraine pushed for independence, and nationalist movements were breaking out from Georgia to Kazakhstan. Gorbachev, unlike previous Soviet leaders, refused to crush these movements with force, and that hesitation sealed the Soviet Union's fate. By 1991, it was over. Hardliners tried a coup in a desperate attempt to save the Union, but it failed spectacularly. By December, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, breaking apart into 15 independent countries. Moscow had lost its empire almost overnight. But here's the thing. Those old internal Soviet borders now became new international borders. And not everyone agreed on where those lines should be drawn. Millions of ethnic Russians suddenly found themselves living in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Baltic states. Separatist movements in places like Chechnya, Abkhazia, and Nagorno-Karabakh erupted into conflict, and Russia wasn't ready to let go of its influence so easily. This is where Russia's modern border disputes begin. The collapse of the USSR left a power vacuum, and Moscow was determined to fill it. The Red Army pulled back from its bases across Eurasia, but Russia still saw its former Soviet neighbors as part of its backyard. And when any of these countries tried to step away from Moscow's influence, Russia made sure to remind them of who was really in charge, whether through economic pressure, political manipulation, or outright military intervention. This is the foundation for every post-Soviet border conflict we see today. Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, China, Japan, Azerbaijan, they all have their own history with Russia. But the root cause is always the same. Moscow believes it's entitled to these lands, and when the opportunity arises, it will move to reclaim influence. The Soviet Union may be gone, but the mentality that built it never left. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia itself was going through one of its worst decades, economically wrecked, politically unstable, and barely holding itself together. But like I said, Moscow wasn't ready to fully let go of its former influence. So the Kremlin declared Russia as the official successor state of the USSR, inheriting its UN Security Council seat, nuclear arsenal, and military infrastructure. But along with these perks came the curse of dwindling influence. Russia now found itself surrounded by newly independent countries, some breaking away entirely, others still tangled in old Soviet dependencies. Almost overnight, Ukraine was independent. The Baltics were looking west. The South Caucasus was set on fire with ethnic wars, and Central Asia was caught between newly found sovereignty and Russian influence. Russia hated to be in this position, but there was very little that they could do. So Russia decided to walk a fine line. On paper, it accepted independence of its neighbors, but in reality, it wanted to stay in control. The Kremlin framed itself as the regional power broker, stepping into conflicts as the so-called peacekeepers. But in many cases, those Russian peacekeeping troops weren't there to resolve disputes. They were there to make sure Russia remained a dominant force in the region. This is when the frozen conflicts we still see today began to take shape. One by one, conflicts erupted along Russia's new frontiers. In Moldova, the breakaway region of Transnistria, with its large Russian-speaking population and Soviet 14th Army units still stationed there, declared independence in 1992. A war broke out, and Russian troops stepped in, not to stop the secession, but to enforce it. The result? A pro-Russian enclave that still exists today, inside Moldova's borders, acting as a frozen conflict Moscow can exploit anytime it wants. A similar story took place in the Caucasus. In Georgia, the moment the Soviet Union collapsed, separatist wars erupted in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 1992 and 1993. With covert Russian backing, these breakaway regions successfully fought off Georgian forces, and by the time the dust settled, both were de facto Russian-controlled territories. And then there was Nagorno-Karabakh. As the Soviet Union fell apart, Armenian fighters, backed by Armenia, fought against Azerbaijan for control of the enclave. By 1994, the war had ended with Armenian forces in control of Karabakh and large parts of Azerbaijan's territory. Russia brokered the ceasefire, but made sure the conflict was never truly settled. In all these cases, Russia played the role of mediator, but in reality, it was using these frozen conflicts to keep its former republics weak and dependent on Moscow. The strategy was clear. By supporting separatist regions and then stationing Russian troops there as peacekeepers, Moscow ensured these newly independent states were permanently unstable and still tied back to Russia's orbit. And this wasn't just a temporary measure. It was a long-term strategy of control, and it would be perfected and repeated in eastern Ukraine years later. But even as Russia manipulated its neighbors' conflicts, it was dealing with an internal war of its own, like the First Chechen War in 1994 through 1996. Unlike Georgia or Moldova, Chechnya wasn't another country. It was a part of Russia itself. When Chechnya declared independence in 1991, Yeltsin sent in the army to crush the rebellion. But what was supposed to be a swift military operation turned into an absolute disaster. The Russian military suffered humiliating defeats, and by 1996, Moscow had no choice but to accept a ceasefire, effectively giving Chechnya de facto independence. This war wasn't just an embarrassment. It exposed just how weak Russia had become. If Moscow couldn't even hold on to its own borders, how could it hope to control its former empire? But the Kremlin also took a lesson from this failure. If separatism ever happened again, Russia wouldn't just respond. It would respond with overwhelming force, crushing any rebellion before it could even gain ground. By the late 1990s, Russia's influence in its backyard had reached its lowest point. NATO and the EU were expanding into Eastern Europe, with former Soviet satellites like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states eagerly joining Western institutions. Moscow was furious, seeing this as a betrayal of Cold War assurances and a direct threat to Russian security. But at the time, Russia was in no position to fight back. It was crippled by the 1998 financial crisis, drowning in corruption and struggling to stay relevant on the world stage. Then came Putin. On New Year's Eve, 1999, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, was handed the Russian presidency. Unlike Yeltsin, Putin wasn't interested in democracy or integrating with the West. He viewed the 1990s as a humiliating decade that needed to be reversed, and his very first move was to crush Chechnya. He launched the Second Chechen War, and this time, Russia used brutal force to flatten the rebellion and reestablish Moscow's rule over the region. This was a warning to separatists everywhere that Moscow was done playing defense. At the same time, Putin set out to restore Russia's great power status. With rising oil prices fueling the economy, he rebuilt the Russian military and intelligence services, expanding state control over key industries, and made it clear that Russia's days of weakness were over. He had one simple goal: to enforce Russian dominance over post-Soviet states, by any means necessary. Throughout the 2000s, Russia tightened its grip over its former Soviet neighbors. Putin created new regional organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union, the EAEU, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO. to bring ex-Soviet states closer to Moscow. He used natural gas as a weapon, cutting off energy supplies to Ukraine and Georgia whenever they drifted too far from Russian influence. And most importantly, as Russia's military grew stronger, Putin became more willing to use force beyond Russia's borders. By 2008, this new approach was put to the test. In August of 2008, tensions between Russia and Georgia exploded into open war. The Georgian government, hoping to reclaim South Ossetia, launched an offensive against separatist forces. Moscow immediately responded, sending in the Russian army. Within days, Georgia's forces were crushed, and Russian tanks advanced to the outskirts of Tbilisi. The war ended in 5 days, with a Russian victory. And just weeks later, Putin made it official. Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. No one else accepted this claim, but Russia had changed the facts on the ground. It had effectively annexed 2 regions of Georgia under Russian military control. Again, even this war sent a clear message to every ex-Soviet state leaning towards the West. Moscow was willing to use force to stop NATO's expansion. After Georgia and Ukraine had been promised potential NATO membership earlier that year, the invasion showed exactly what Russia would do to countries that tried to break away. The next time Moscow used this strategy, it was on a much larger scale. In 2014, Russia shocked the world by seizing Crimea from Ukraine, the first time since World War II that a European country annexed another nation's land by force. This wasn't just another border dispute, it was a direct challenge to the post-Cold War order. The move triggered the ongoing war in Ukraine, by far Russia's biggest and most consequential conflict. And, just like in Georgia, Russia used separatism as a weapon, this time backing rebels in eastern Ukraine to keep the country divided. From that moment on, Russian foreign policy was clear: entrench military control in breakaway regions, wage wars to challenge post-Soviet borders, and push back against NATO expansion by force. By the 2020s, Putin had made his ambitions explicit. He demanded a rollback of NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and, in February of 2022, launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, attempting once again to redraw borders by force. But to fully understand Russia's border conflicts, we have to break them down case by case. Each dispute, each country, tells a different piece of the same story, and together they paint a picture of a Russia that's haunted by its imperial past and driven by present-day strategic calculations. In a few minutes, you'll start to understand how Russia's relationships with its neighbors have dangled between cooperation and conflict, why certain borders remain hotly contested, and how Putin's policies have made the situation much worse. The best example to start with is obviously Ukraine. No country is more important to Russia's territorial ambitions and historical grievances than Ukraine. The ties between Russia and Ukraine go back centuries. Both nations trace their origins to Kievan Rus, a medieval state centered in Kiev. But over time, Ukraine became contested land. By the late 18th century, the Russian Empire had absorbed most of Ukraine, and under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the most important republics, both economically and militarily. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the USSR, home to its heavy industries, and hosted key Soviet military assets, including the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. But when Ukraine declared independence in 1991, it delivered a death blow to the Soviet Union. For Moscow, the loss of Ukraine wasn't just emotional, it was a strategic disaster. A massive chunk of the Soviet military, economy, and industrial power was suddenly outside Russian control, where still the newly drawn border cut through regions with large Russian-speaking populations, especially in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Yet, throughout the 1990s, Russia officially respected Ukraine's borders. In 1994, Moscow even signed the Budapest Memorandum, pledging to respect Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons. But that was a play. Russia never truly accepted Ukraine's independence, especially as Kyiv drifted further towards the west. By the 2000s, Ukraine was pulling away from Moscow's influence, and the Kremlin wasn't happy. In 2004, the Orange Revolution erupted in Kyiv, a massive uprising against electoral fraud, which ultimately brought pro-Western leader Viktor Yushchenko to power. He pushed for closer ties with the EU and NATO, something Putin saw as a direct threat. Though Ukraine's NATO membership was never materialized, the mere possibility of a Western military influence in Ukraine was unacceptable to Russia. Meanwhile, in Crimea and the Donbass, pro-Russian sentiment remained strong. The Kremlin kept close ties with local politicians and fanned the idea that Ukraine belongs in Russia's orbit. Then, in 2013, the situation exploded. Ukraine's then-president, Viktor Yanukovych, was seen as a Moscow ally. But when he suddenly rejected an EU trade deal under Russian pressure, mass protests, the Euromaidan, erupted across Ukraine. It's important to note this was about the EU. NATO was not in Ukraine's mindset at all. The demonstrations toppled Yanukovych in February of 2014, forcing him to flee to Russia. For Putin, this wasn't just a Ukrainian crisis. It was a Western-backed coup, a direct challenge to Russia's influence. And Russia responded with stunning speed. Within days of Yanukovych's ousting, Russian special forces, disguised as Little Green Men, seized Crimea. By March 2014, after a sham referendum, Russia formally annexed Crimea, a move condemned by nearly every country in the world. Putin justified the annexation by claiming Crimea had always been Russian, and that he was protecting ethnic Russians. But in reality, this was a geopolitical masterstroke. It secured Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, cut off Ukraine's access to offshore energy resources, and sent a message to the world that Russia was willing to rewrite borders by force. But Crimea was only the beginning. Russia then ignited an armed rebellion in Donbass by backing separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. By April of 2014, pro-Russian militias, armed and trained by Moscow, declared the creation of breakaway republics. Ukraine's military moved in to crush the rebellion, but regular Russian forces secretly entered the fight, ensuring that the separatists held large chunks of territory. The war in Donbass dragged on, becoming Europe's deadliest conflict since the Balkan Wars, killing over 14,000 people by the end of 2021. Two ceasefires, Minsk I and II, were brokered in 2014 and 2015, but they only froze the conflict, leaving Russia-backed separatists in control. For Moscow, this was a win. Ukraine was destabilized and unable to join NATO, and still tied to Russian influence. But by 2021, Putin had had enough of the frozen conflict. He wanted more. Russia amassed over 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders, claiming it was responding to NATO's expansion. Diplomatic talks failed. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, attacking from the north in Belarus, the east in Donbass, and the south, Crimea. Even this time, Putin had one goal: overthrow Ukraine's government and install a pro-Russian regime. Putin likely expected a quick victory. Instead, he got fierce Ukrainian resistance. Kyiv didn't fall. President Zelensky refused to flee, and the West responded with massive sanctions and military aid. By spring of 2022, Russia's assault on Kyiv collapsed, forcing Moscow to retreat from northern Ukraine and focus on the Donbass and southern fronts. In the south, Russia seized Mariupol after a brutal siege, creating a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. Then, in September of 2022, Putin declared the annexation of 4 more Ukrainian territories: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. The war dragged into 2023, with Ukraine mounting counteroffensives and Russia digging in. The fight was no longer just about Ukraine. It became a war over the future of Europe's borders. In other words, Russia's war in Ukraine isn't just about land. It's about power, influence, and the refusal to accept post-Soviet borders. But this war had already reshaped the world. NATO has expanded, Russia is more isolated, and Ukraine is closer to the West than ever before. So if Putin succeeds, even partially, it might encourage him for further aggression. And there's one country that understands this best: Georgia. By the few points I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm pretty sure you understand that Georgia's history with Russia is long and complicated. But let's dive a bit more into the specifics. Georgia was absorbed into the Russian Empire in the 19th century. It experienced a brief period of independence from 1918 to 1921, and was then invaded by the Red Army and turned into a Soviet republic. Under Soviet rule, Georgia was given 2 autonomous regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, both home to distinct ethnic groups with separatist leanings. These tensions were largely suppressed under the USSR, but when Georgia regained independence in 1991, the conflicts exploded. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Georgia declared independence under Zviad Gamsakuriya, and later Edward Shevardnadze, a former Soviet foreign minister, took control. But almost immediately, the new Georgian state was challenged. Both Abkhazia and South Ossetia pushed for independence, driven by ethnic divisions, fear of Georgian nationalism, and quiet encouragement from Moscow. In the early 1990s, brutal wars broke out. In Abkhazia, separatists backed by Russian volunteers and elements of the Russian military fought Georgian forces in 1992 and 1993. It resulted in a bloody campaign of ethnic cleansing that drove most ethnic Georgians out of Abkhazia. A similar story took place in South Ossetia, where a war between Georgian troops and Ossetian separatists ended with the region breaking away from Georgia's control. By the mid-1990s, Georgia had lost both regions, which then declared themselves independent republics. But here's where Russia's role became impossible to ignore. Moscow brokered ceasefires in both wars. Russian peacekeepers weren't neutral. They were Russian soldiers, ensuring that the separatists stayed in power. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Georgia's government was weak and had little choice but to accept Russian influence. But that changed in 2003. After the Rose Revolution, Mikhail Saakashvili came to power, a young, Western-leaning leader determined to break Georgia away from Russia. He cracked down on corruption, pushed for NATO membership, and tried to reintegrate the separatist regions. His pro-Western stance infuriated Putin, who saw Georgia's moves towards NATO and the EU as direct threats. Tensions rose fast. Russia handed out passports to people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, a classic Kremlin tactic to later justify intervention under the claims of protecting Russian citizens. Meanwhile, Georgia doubled down on its efforts to assert control over the regions, setting the stage for an all-out war. By August of 2008, things had reached a boiling point. After months of escalating clashes, Georgia launched a military operation to retake South Ossetia, arguing that Russian-backed militants were attacking Georgian villages. Russia's response was overwhelming. Claiming to be acting as peacekeepers, Russian tanks, troops, and aircraft poured into Georgia, crushing Georgian forces within days. But Russia didn't stop at South Ossetia. Its troops pushed deep into Georgia itself, advancing towards the capital, Tbilisi. Meanwhile, in Abkhazia, Russia opened a second front, helping Abkhaz fighters drive out the last remnants of Georgian forces. The war only lasted 5 days, but it was devastating. Hundreds were killed, tens of thousands of ethnic Georgians were permanently displaced, and Georgia lost all remaining control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. By August 12th, a ceasefire was signed, but the damage had been done. 2 weeks later, Russia officially recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent countries. This was a direct challenge to Georgia's sovereignty, and nearly every country in the world rejected it. But Russia didn't care. It established permanent military bases in both regions, stationed thousands of troops, and signed treaties with their separatist governments. By the end of 2008, 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory was under Russian occupation. For Georgia, the 2008 war was a national trauma. In fact, Georgia's NATO bid has been effectively frozen ever since, as the presence of active territorial disputes makes membership nearly impossible. But Russia didn't just hold the land it took in 2008, it kept pushing the boundaries further. Since 2011, Russian forces in South Ossetia have been slowly moving border fences deeper into Georgia, taking over farms, homes, and villages overnight. This borderization happens quietly, piece by piece, using old Soviet maps as justification. Entire communities have been split in half, with some Georgians waking up to find themselves suddenly in Russian-controlled territory. This slow, undeclared expansion has been a nightmare for locals. Families have been cut off from their farms. People have been abducted by Russian border guards, and protests have been ignored. It's a strategy designed to keep Georgia weak, divided, and unable to fully align with the West. More than 15 years after the war, Georgia remains a fractured country. Abkhazia and South Ossetia are effectively Russian military zones, with thousands of Russian troops stationed there in violation of the 2008 ceasefire. Georgia insists these regions are still part of its territory, but realistically, they are Russian-occupied land. Whenever Georgia moves closer to NATO or the EU, Russia retaliates with threats, provocations, or more land grabs. The Georgian people overwhelmingly support Western integration, but their government has to walk a fine line. Pushing too hard could trigger another Russian intervention. And in many ways, Georgia was the test run for Ukraine. The world's weak response in 2008, a few sanctions and diplomatic protests, but no real consequences, taught Putin a lesson. He saw that he could get away with taking land by force. And 6 years later, in 2014, he applied the same playbook to Crimea. Today, Georgia remains a warning sign for other countries in Russia's neighborhood. While there's no active war, the situation is far from stable. For the thousands of ethnic Georgians forced out of their homes, the promise of returning remains just that, a promise. And as long as Putin stays in power, Georgia will remain under threat, a country permanently caught between Russia's imperial ambitions and its own aspirations for freedom. But that's not the case with Finland. In fact, Russia's aggression towards this country ended up backfiring. Putin wanted to stop NATO expansion, but he ended up doubling Russia's border with NATO. For centuries, Finland has existed in a complicated balance with Russia, sometimes as a battleground, sometimes as a buffer. The two share a 1,300-kilometer border, making Finland one of Russia's most significant neighbors. For much of modern history, Finland had no choice but to carefully manage its relationship with Moscow. Originally controlled by the Swedish Empire, Finland was ceded to Russia in 1809 and became an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. But when World War I and the Russian Revolution threw Russia into chaos, Finland seized its chance for independence in 1917. Unlike many of Russia's other breakaway territories, Finland managed to stay out of Soviet control, but that didn't mean Moscow was willing to let it go without consequences. By the late 1930s, Stalin saw Finland as a strategic risk. The border was too close to Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, just 32 kilometers away, and, in Stalin's mind, that was an unacceptable security threat. The Soviets demanded that Finland give up land to create a buffer zone, offering territory somewhere else in return. Finland refused, and in November of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded, starting the Winter War. Despite being massively outnumbered, the Finnish forces fought with legendary resilience. Soviet troops expected an easy victory, but instead, they found themselves bogged down in brutal winter conditions, suffering heavy casualties. Finnish snipers, camouflaged ski troops, and guerrilla tactics wreaked havoc on the invading Red Army. Eventually, the Red Army's sheer numbers wore Finland down, and by March of 1940, Helsinki was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland lost around 9 to 11% of its territory, including the Karelia region, but managed to preserve its independence. More than 400,000 Karelians, 12% of Finland's population, were forced to evacuate, unwilling to live under Soviet rule. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Finland saw an opportunity to take back its lost land. Aligning with Germany, Finland launched the Continuation War, reclaiming Karelia and even besieging Leningrad from the north. But unlike Germany, Finland wasn't fighting for conquest. It only wanted to regain its lost territory. However, by 1944, the Soviets had regained the upper hand and forced Finland to another armistice. In 1947, the Paris Peace Treaty cemented Finland's territorial losses. And to make things worse, the Soviets demanded a long-term lease of the Pohjola Peninsula as a naval base. While that lease ended in 1956, Finland had learned a harsh lesson. It could never afford to be openly hostile towards Moscow without facing devastating consequences. Unlike most of Eastern Europe, Finland was never occupied by Soviet troops or forced into the Warsaw Pact. Instead, it entered a strange in-between status known as Finlandinization, a form of constrained independence where Finland had to avoid provoking the Soviet Union at all costs. Under the 1948 Finno-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Finland agreed to never join any alliance hostile to the USSR, and to consult Moscow on security issues. Officially, Finland was neutral, but in reality, it had to self-censor its foreign policy, limit its military, and carefully avoid offending Soviet interests. Yet, despite this act, Finland remained a democracy with a market economy, trading with both the West and the Soviet bloc. Presidents like Urho Kekkonen mastered the art of balancing relations, ensuring that Finland stayed independent without triggering Soviet intervention. But secretly, Finns never forgot what they had lost. The Karelian question, whether Finland could ever reclaim its ceded lands, remained an unspoken national wound. To keep the peace, Finland chose not to challenge post-World War II borders, and in return, the USSR let Finland keep its sovereignty. This uneasy arrangement lasted for decades, until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. With Moscow's power shattered, Finland quickly moved westward. It joined the European Union in 1995, seeing it as a way to secure its economic and political future. But when it came to NATO, Finland hesitated. Many Finns believed joining NATO might provoke Russia unnecessarily. Instead, Finland chose military non-alignment, but quietly strengthened ties with NATO by participating in joint exercises and ensuring that, if needed, Finland could integrate into Western defense structures quickly. Even as Russia's relations with the West soured in the 2010s, Finland tried to keep diplomatic channels open. But then, in 2022, Putin invaded Ukraine, and everything changed. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call. For Finland, it proved that neutrality meant nothing if Russia decided to attack. Almost overnight, Finnish public opinion flipped, with a majority of citizens now supporting NATO membership, a position that has been deeply divided before. Finland's leaders wasted no time. By May of 2022, Finland and Sweden submitted formal NATO applications, abandoning decades of military non-alignment. Russia, predictably, threatened consequences, but its army was too busy struggling in Ukraine to do anything beyond issue warnings. By April of 2023, Finland was officially a NATO member. This meant that NATO's borders with Russia doubled. adding an extra 1,300-kilometer line, something Putin had desperately tried to avoid. For Russia, this was a massive strategic defeat. The very war launched to stop NATO's growth had triggered its biggest expansion in decades. Putin's government called Finland's move a mistake, warning that it would undermine regional security. Russia suspended diplomatic ties, moved some military units closer to the Finnish border, and hinted at deploying nuclear weapons in its northern regions. But then again, there was very little that Putin could do. After all, most of his army and resources were tied up in Ukraine. In fact, some reports suggested that Russia had to pull soldiers away from the Finnish border just to sustain its failing war effort. For Finland, NATO membership removed decades of strategic uncertainty. Now, any Russian aggression would trigger a collective NATO response under Article 5. That's why the Finland-Russia border is now peaceful. From a historic perspective, the irony is striking. In 1939, Stalin invaded Finland because he feared Western influence near Leningrad. Now, in 2023, NATO is right on Russia's doorstep because of Putin's own war. Finland's story is a perfect example of how Russia's aggression often backfires, producing the exact outcome it was trying to prevent. Instead of intimidating its neighbors into submission, Russia has driven them towards alliances that directly weaken its own position. Where does China stand? After all, Xi Jinping famously called the Russia-China relationship a no-limits partnership. But is that really the case? Well, not exactly. You see, Russia and China share one of the world's longest borders, 4,200 kilometers. That's about 2,600 miles. This border has seen war, betrayal, and extreme layers of diplomacy. For centuries, Russia and China have dandled between cooperation and rivalry, alliance and suspicion. Their border conflicts shaped modern geopolitics, and their current partnership, while seemingly strong, is still built on strategic necessity rather than genuine trust. In the 19th century, Russia's expansion into Siberia and the Far East came at China's expense. The Qing dynasty, already in decline, was forced to sign a series of humiliating treaties with European powers, including Russia. The Treaty of Aigan, 1858, and the Treaty of Peking, in 1860, transferred vast swaths of Manchurian territory to Russia, including the lands around Amur and Ussuri rivers. This gave Russia control over what is now the Russian Far East, including the region of Vladivostok, where one of Russia's most strategic Pacific ports was later established. To this day, these treaties are remembered in China as a part of the Century of Humiliation, a period of foreign encroachments that China has never forgotten. Though these lands were officially ceded, China's historical memory still considers them a painful loss. Fast forward to the 20th century. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the newly formed Soviet Union initially supported the Chinese Communist Party. When Mao Zedong's forces won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the USSR and the newly founded People's Republic of China appeared to be strong allies. For much of the 1950s, Moscow and Beijing cooperated closely. The Soviet Union provided China with military aid, industrial technology, and ideological guidance, while both states stood united against their common enemy, the United States and the Western world. But by the late 1950s, this alliance collapsed into bitter rivalry in what became known as the Sino-Soviet split. The reasons were both ideological and strategic. Mao resented Soviet dominance, believing that China should be the true leader of world communism, not the USSR. Meanwhile, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev viewed Mao as reckless and dangerously radical. What began as political disagreements quickly escalated into a full-blown geopolitical conflict, with a long border between them becoming a dangerous flashpoint. By the 1960s, relations had soured so much that China and the Soviet Union were on the brink of war. The most serious clash came in March of 1969 on the Ussuri River, at Damansky Island, or Zhenbaodao in Chinese. Chinese troops ambushed Soviet border guards, triggering a fierce battle that left dozens dead on both sides. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the two nuclear-armed giants were about to go into a full-scale war. There were even reports that Moscow considered launching a preemptive nuclear strike on China's nuclear facilities. This could have changed history forever, but in the end, the crisis de-escalated after frantic diplomacy. But the border remained heavily militarized for years. Throughout the 1970s, millions of troops were stationed along the border, and both nations prepared for the possibility of an all-out war. Ironically, the Sino-Soviet split pushed China into an unexpected new partnership with the United States. In 1972, Richard Nixon visited Beijing, beginning a historic shift in global alliances. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union found itself trapped in a two-front Cold War, facing NATO in the West and a hostile China in the East. It wasn't until the 1980s that relations began to soften. Deng Xiaoping's China and Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union took steps towards normalization. In 1991, just months before the USSR collapsed, the two sides signed an agreement that largely settled their eastern border. After the Soviet Union fell, Russia and China continued this process, finalizing border deals through 1994, 1997, 1999, and 2004. One of the last major settlements was in 2004, when Russia agreed to hand over Terebarov Island, Yinglong Island in Chinese, and half of another island to China. By 2008, the Russia-China border was fully demarcated, making it one of the few Russian borders that doesn't have an active territorial dispute today. With the border settled, Russia and China found a new reason to cooperate: their shared opposition to US global dominance. Both countries promoted a multipolar world, resisting Western influence and NATO expansion. They created new frameworks like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to counterbalance American alliances. Economically, the relationship blossomed. China became Russia's largest trading partner, buying vast amounts of Russian oil, gas, and raw materials. The Power of Siberia gas pipeline, opened in 2019, further deepened their economic interdependence. But despite this partnership, there's a clear imbalance. China is now the dominant power, while Russia is increasingly the junior partner. Russians privately express concern about China's long-term intentions in Siberia and the Russia Far East. The demographic difference is staggering. Only 6 to 7 million Russians live in the vast, resource-rich Russian Far East, while across the border in China's Heilongjiang province, tens of millions of Chinese reside. Some Russians fear a future where China dominates the region economically or even demographically, though Beijing has shown no official interest in challenging the current borders. In February of 2022, just weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin and Xi Jinping met in Beijing and declared a no-limits partnership. But when the war actually began, China found itself in an awkward position. Beijing didn't officially endorse the invasion, but it also refused to condemn it. Instead, China blamed NATO and continued to buy Russian energy at discounted prices, keeping Russia's economy afloat under sanctions. At the United Nations, China abstained on votes rather than fully backing Russia. While China provided economic and diplomatic cover, it stopped short of direct military aid, likely to avoid secondary sanctions on its own companies. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union dictated the terms of its relationship with China. Today, that dynamic has completely reversed. China has far surpassed Russia in economic power, global influence, and long-term strategic leverage. Putin and Xi might have presented a united front, but beneath the surface, Russia is increasingly dependent on Chinese support. For now, Russia and China remain close partners, bound by a shared opposition to Western dominance. But that's not the only thing they have in common. They also share a common rival to the east: Japan. For China, Japan is an historical enemy, a nation that invaded its territory during World War II, committing atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, and occupying vast swaths of Chinese land. The wounds of that history still run deep, fueling long-standing tensions over disputed territories in the East China Sea. But this video is about Russia, and Russia's main unresolved issues with Japan is the Kuril Islands dispute. This dispute, known in Japan as the Northern Territories issue, is one of Russia's longest-standing border conflicts, one that has remained frozen for over 7 decades. The root of the dispute traces back to the final days of World War II, when the Soviet Union launched a last-minute invasion of Japanese-held territories, seizing the Kuril Chain and southern Sakhalin. The Kuril Islands stretch from Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula down towards Japan's northern island, Hokkaido, forming a strategic barrier between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Ocean. Beyond their geopolitical value, the islands hold rich fishing waters, potential gas and oil reserves, and significant military importance. Historically, the islands have been claimed by both Russia and Japan, but by the late 19th century, the two sides had reached an agreement. Under the 1875 Treaty of St. Petersburg, Russia handed over the entire Kuril chain to Japan, while in return, Japan renounced any claim to Sakhalin, giving Russia full control over that larger island. This peacefully settled the border until World War II messed everything up. In August of 1945, as World War II was drawing to a close, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, honoring a promise made to the US and the UK at the Yalta Conference. Within days, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive, storming Japanese-controlled territories, including southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. By September of 1945, the entire Kuril chain was under Soviet control, and the Japanese civilian population was expelled to Japan. Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and the Hambomai Inlets. These 4 islands were the most important in the overall dispute. Japan insists that these islands have always been a part of its territory and were never meant to be included in the Soviet wartime conquests. Moscow, however, disagrees, arguing that the entire Kuril chain was rightfully transferred to Soviet control as part of the post-war settlements. You see, at the Yalta Conference, the Allied powers agreed that the Kurils would go to the Soviet Union. In the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan formally renounced its claims to the Kuril Islands, but the treaty never explicitly granted them to the Soviet Union, and the USSR never signed that treaty. Japan later argued that the 4 disputed islands were never part of the Kuril chain, but rather extensions of Hokkaido, meaning they were not covered by Japan's renunciation. This legal loophole became the foundation of Japan's continued claims. Because of this unresolved territorial dispute, Japan and the Soviet Union never signed a formal peace treaty after World War II. Technically, their war never officially ended, remaining in a legal state of war secession rather than a full peace. During the Cold War, this territorial conflict kept Japan and the Soviet Union at arm's length. The United States backed Japan's claims unofficially, making it clear that normalizing relations with Moscow would require resolving the Kuril issue. In 1956, the 2 sides came to a resolution. The USSR and Japan signed a joint declaration, agreeing to restore diplomatic ties. As part of the deal, the Soviet Union even agreed to return Shikotan and the Hambomai Inlets, the 2 smaller islands, after a peaceful treaty was signed. But that treaty never materialized because the US pressured Japan not to settle for 2 islands, suggesting that if Japan gave up claims to the larger 2, the US might keep Okinawa under American administration indefinitely. So Japan refused to settle, and the issue remained frozen. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Japan hoped that a weakened Russia might be willing to compromise. In the 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, there were serious discussions about a possible settlement, but Russian public opinion and nationalist opposition made it politically impossible for any leader to hand over land that had been won in World War II. Then came Putin. Throughout the 2010s, Putin engaged in diplomacy with Japan, particularly with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The 1956 Joint Declaration was revived, and negotiations focused on the transfer of Shikotan and Hambomai, the same 2-island solution that had been discussed decades earlier. But in 2020, Putin decisively shut the door. Russia amended its constitution, adding a clause that banned the cession of any Russian territory. This effectively made it illegal to return any of the Kuril Islands to Japan. From that point on, the territorial dispute was no longer up for discussion, at least from Russia's perspective. Then came 2022. Japan strongly condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, aligning itself with the G7 nations in sanctioning Moscow. This meant a complete collapse of Russia-Japan relations. In response, Putin's government withdrew from all peace treaty negotiations, suspended joint economic projects, and revoked agreements that allowed Japanese families to visit the graves on the islands. For the first time in decades, Japan explicitly called Russia's occupation of the islands illegal, language that it had previously avoided. With both sides hardening their positions, the possibility of resolving the dispute vanished entirely. With no peace treaty and no negotiations, the Kuril Islands dispute remains a frozen conflict. Russia has steadily increased its military presence on the islands, deploying advanced missile systems, expanding military bases, and conducting regular military drills in the region. For Russia, the islands serve a critical military function. They help secure the Sea of Okhotsk, where Russia's Pacific Fleet and nuclear submarines operate. Controlling the Kurils ensures Russian dominance over its eastern naval approaches, making them far more than just a historical trophy. For Japan, the dispute represents a painful, unfinished chapter of World War II. The issue prevents a full diplomatic relationship with Russia, and domestically, no Japanese government can sign a peace treaty without addressing the islands. The Kuril Islands dispute is a textbook example of how territorial conflicts can remain unresolved for generations. Now, lastly, we have one last major problem, from the Pacific to the South Caucasus. Russia's border conflicts applies to this region as well. Here, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been locked in a brutal struggle over Nagorno-Karabakh for over a century. Nagorno-Karabakh, known as Artsakh to Armenians, is a mountainous region historically populated by ethnic Armenians, but was placed under Azerbaijani control during the Soviet era. The origins of this dispute stretch back through centuries of Persian, Ottoman, and Russian influence, as Christian Armenians and Turkic Azuris lived under competing empires. By the 19th century, the Russian Empire had absorbed both Armenia and Azerbaijan, setting the stage for modern tensions. After World War I, when the Russian Empire collapsed, both Armenia and Azerbaijan laid claim to Nagorno-Karabakh. leading to violent clashes. When the Soviet Union took control over the Caucasus in the 1920s, Joseph Stalin's nationality policies placed Nagorno-Karabakh under Azerbaijani administration. Despite its overwhelmingly Armenian population, the region was granted an autonomous status, but this sowed the seeds for future conflict. A territory with a strong ethnic identity, trapped inside an artificial border, governed by a state it did not want to be a part of. For decades, the issue was kept dormant under Soviet rule. Open dissent was impossible in Stalin's USSR. But when Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms in the 1980s, allowing greater political openness, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh saw a chance to break away. In 1988, the regional legislature of Nagorno-Karabakh passed a resolution demanding to be transferred from Soviet Azerbaijan to Soviet Armenia. The Soviet government rejected the demand, but the fuse had been lit. What followed was a chain reaction of violence. Pogroms erupted as Armenians were massacred in Azerbaijani cities, and Azuris were expelled from Armenia. The conflict spiraled out of control, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Karabakh Armenians declared independence. This was an act of secession from Azerbaijan, igniting a full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The First Nagorno-Karabakh War was a brutal and bloody conflict, marked by ethnic cleansing, atrocities, and mass displacement. Armenia, backing the Karabakh Armenian forces, managed to defeat Azerbaijan militarily, and not only secured Nagorno-Karabakh itself, but also occupied 7 surrounding Azerbaijani districts, creating a land corridor linking the region to Armenia. By the time a Russian-brokered ceasefire was signed in 1994, Azerbaijan had suffered a crushing defeat. More than 600,000 Azerbaijanis were expelled from Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding areas, while the self-proclaimed Republic of Artsakh functioned as an Armenian-controlled entity inside Azerbaijan's internationally recognized borders. Russia, despite being the mediator, had played both sides. It sold weapons to both Armenia and Azerbaijan, ensuring neither side could fully win, keeping both dependent on Moscow's influence, a classic divide-and-rule strategy. This freezing of the conflict ensured that for the next 26 years, Moscow would remain the key power broker in the region. While no full-scale war broke out during this period, clashes among the borders remained frequent and deadly. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan, flush with oil and gas wealth, rebuilt its military with the help of Turkey, Israel, and even Russia itself. By the late 2010s, Azerbaijan was preparing for a rematch. In 2020, after years of diplomatic deadlock and military posturing, Azerbaijan launched a full-scale offensive to retake Nagorno-Karabakh. This war lasted just 44 days, but completely changed the balance of power in the South Caucasus. Azerbaijan's forces, armed with cutting-edge drones, precision artillery, and Turkish military support, rapidly broke through Armenian defenses. The war exposed Armenia's vulnerabilities, with its outdated military struggling against Azerbaijan's high-tech warfare. Russia, despite being Armenia's official ally, refused to intervene militarily. The reason? The fighting was technically on Azerbaijani territory, and since Armenia itself wasn't attacked, Russia's defense pact with Armenia did not apply. In November of 2020, as Azerbaijan was on the brink of total victory, Armenia was forced to surrender. A Russia-brokered ceasefire ended the war, with Armenia ceding large portions of Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding Azerbaijani regions. Crucially, Russia deployed 2,000 peacekeepers to oversee the remaining Armenian-controlled areas and the Lachin corridor, the lifeline connecting Karabakh to Armenia. For Russia, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Azerbaijan had won, a major setback for Armenian influence. On the other, Russia now had a direct military presence inside Nagorno-Karabakh, giving it leverage over both sides. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Moscow became preoccupied with its own war, and Azerbaijan saw an opportunity. Sensing Russia's distraction, Azerbaijan tightened its grip on Nagorno-Karabakh, blocking the Lachin corridor and effectively besieging the remaining Armenian population. Then, in September of 2023, Azerbaijan launched a full military operation to eliminate Armenian control over Karabakh once and for all. This time, the war lasted less than 24 hours. The Karabakh Armenian forces surrendered almost immediately, and within days, 120,000 Armenians fled the region in mass exodus, one of the fastest ethnic displacements in modern history. Russia's 2,000 peacekeepers did nothing. They stood by as Azerbaijan dismantled the self-proclaimed Nagorno-Karabakh Republic and reasserted full sovereignty over the region. Putin's failure to protect Armenia shattered Russia's credibility as a security guarantor. For Armenia, this was a national catastrophe. The centuries-old Armenian presence in Karabakh was erased overnight. For Azerbaijan, it was an historic victory, with President Ilham Aliyev declaring the conflict over. For decades, Russia had maintained control over the Caucasus by keeping conflicts like Nagorno-Karabakh unresolved. Now that strategy has backfired. Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, has emerged as the dominant force in the region. Armenia, feeling betrayed by Russia, is now questioning its reliance on Moscow. Russia's failure to act has raised doubts about its security guarantees, not just in Armenia, but across the entire post-Soviet sphere. Armenia is now exploring closer ties with the West, refusing to host CSTO military drills and engaging with European Union peace monitors. Protesters in Yerevan even called for Armenia to leave Russia's orbit entirely, a once unthinkable scenario. Meanwhile, Turkey has expanded its influence in the region, shifting the Caucasus powers balance away from Moscow. For Putin, the collapse of Russian influence in the Caucasus is a major blow. It underscores Russia's fading ability to control its borders and project power to its former empire. With Azerbaijan triumphant, Armenia disillusioned, and Turkey emboldened, the South Caucasus is no longer a Russian-controlled chessboard. It is a region slipping from Moscow's grip. So, clearly, you can see now how Russia's border disputes are not merely a consequence of geography, but a direct result of historical legacies, strategic culture, and political choices that have shaped its trajectory for centuries. From Ukraine to Georgia, from the frozen Urals to the Caucasus, Russia's disputes are shaped by the collapse of the Soviet Union, an imperial mindset that refuses to fade, and a security doctrine that views its neighbors not as independent nations, but as buffer zones and strategic assets. One of the most deliberate tools Russia has used to maintain influence over its former empire is the creation of constant conflicts. In regions like Transnistria, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Donbass and Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia has purposely created endless conflicts. This way, not only do they remain dependent on Moscow, but it's also effective against the West, particularly against NATO and the European Union. Both organizations prefer not to accept members with active territorial disputes, as it could drag them into an automatic military confrontation with Russia. This is why countries like Georgia and Ukraine, despite their aspirations, have been stuck in a political limbo. By keeping chunks of their territory in dispute, Moscow ensures that these nations remain stuck between the East and the West, unable to fully escape its shadow. Another key driver of Russia's border conflicts is ethnic politics. Putin and the Kremlin have repeatedly cast themselves as the protectors of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers abroad, using this as a pretext for intervention. This was the primary justification for the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Moscow claimed it was defending Russian-speaking populations from persecution. This narrative is tied to the concept of Ruski Mir, Russian world. The belief that Russia has a civilizational responsibility to defend and unify all Russian speakers and Orthodox Slavs under its sphere of influence. This ideology is not just about nationalism, it's also about justifying territorial expansion. Whenever there is a Russian minority or historic Russian presence in a neighboring country, the Kremlin sees an opportunity or an obligation to intervene. This has been a source of deep tensions in places like Kazakhstan, where a sizable Russian minority resides, and the Baltic states, where Russian-speaking populations have sometimes been used as a wedge issue by Moscow. Even when there is no actual persecution, Russia just makes stuff up about local Russian populations being the victims in need of protection. This pattern is similar to other historical revanchist movements, from Germany's claims on Sudetenland in the 1930s to Siberia's intervention in Bosnia and Croatia in the 1990s. Beyond ethnic justifications, Russia's border disputes are deeply tied to its strategic worldview. Russian history is filled with invasions from the West: Napoleon in 1812, the British and French in the Crimean War, and Hitler's invasion in 1941. This has fostered a deeply ingrained geopolitical paranoia, a belief that Russia must always maintain a buffer between itself and potential enemies. During the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact nations acted as this buffer, providing a protective belt of satellite states against NATO. But after 1991, these buffers vanished one by one, as Poland and the Baltic states, Romania, and others joined NATO. From Moscow's perspective, this was a direct assault on its security. Every step of NATO expansion shrunk the strategic depth that Russia relies on for its defense. This is why Russia has fought so aggressively to keep Ukraine and Georgia out of Western alliances. As I said, the war in Ukraine is, in many ways, about more than just Crimea or Donbass. It's about ensuring Ukraine never becomes a pro-NATO state on Russia's doorstep. Similarly, the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is about preventing Georgia from fully breaking free. Even Finland's NATO accession in 2023 was seen as a severe blow, as it eliminated a long-held neutral buffer in the north. There is also a strong domestic political dimension to Russia's border conflicts. For authoritarian regimes, external conflicts serve as a distraction from internal problems. Every major military action by Putin, from Georgia in 2008 to Crimea in 2014 to Ukraine in 2022, has been accompanied by a spike in domestic support, as Russians rally around the flag. Expansionism is not just about foreign policy, it's also about maintaining control at home. A strong, aggressive Russia is part of Putin's image, and reversing the losses of the 1990s plays well with nationalist sentiment. This is why any retreat or concession is seen as unacceptable, because it could undermine Putin's legitimacy. However, this strategy has risks. If Russia's wars become too costly, as in Ukraine, domestic dissatisfaction can grow. Already, cracks are appearing. Economic sanctions, military casualties, and prolonged conflict are draining Russia's resources. If the Ukraine war ends in failure, it could destabilize the Kremlin itself. Looking ahead, Russia's border disputes will shape its future. Will the Kremlin double down on expansion, hoping to secure its vision of a greater Russia? Or will military failures, economic decline, and international pushback force Russia into a defensive posture? If Russia prevails in Ukraine, it may continue pressing westward, testing NATO's resolve in Moldova or the Baltics. But if Ukraine manages to push Russia back, it could be the beginning of Russia's strategic decline, leading to more internal problems and less ability to project power abroad. One thing is clear: as long as Russia sees its borders as fluid and its neighbors as vassals, conflict will continue. Only when Russia abandons its imperial mindset can it achieve lasting peace. Whether that moment comes sooner or later will define not just Russia's fate, but the security of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Thanks for watching.